Hello, this is Mark Galeotti with a rumination on modern and not so modern Russia. One of the areas for discussion at the moment is the rehabilitation of the 16th century Tsar Ivan the Terrible. There's statues going up, his role within history is being reassessed, and when we say reassessed, we basically mean sugar-coated. And on one level, this is presented as a sign of how awful the current regime is, the fact that it wants to bring a whole variety of thoroughly unpleasant actors back into the fold. Because after all, the ghost at the feast is after all always Stalin and the role that he plays within modern Russian history. However, at the same time, on one level, I can actually understand the desire to have a more balanced understanding of Ivan the Terrible's role. It's worth mentioning, after all, when English language sort of discussion of Ivan comes about, it's always somewhat hamstrung by that term, Ivan the Terrible, carries with it certain implications. But the thing is, the Russian word grozny, terrible, really actually is more like the Greek Deinos. It carries with it overtones of just so awe-inspiring and amazing that it's a bit scary. We could call him Ivan the Awesome, but that does make him sound a little bit like a Californian surfer dude, so I can understand why we don't. Maybe Ivan the Formidable would actually be a more accurate representation. And in his own way, he was formidable. It's not an accident that he is the first of the Tsars of Russia before the Grand Princes. In the first part of his reign, after all, in so many ways, he actually created the foundations of the modern Russian state. He was involved in a sort of massive codification of the laws and also a shifting of the relationship between the Tsar and the Church. He made great efforts to create stronger national but also regional elites with his so-called thousanders. He set up the nucleus of what would become a standing army for Russia, the streltsy, the riflemen or the shooters. He created foundations for a Russian bureaucracy, his so-called izby, which translates as huts, but we can really think of them more as offices. And if you look at, for example, the MVD, today's Interior Ministry, it tracks its own history back to the Razboynaya izba, the banditry office that Ivan set up. Likewise, the Foreign Office, the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, sets its own history back all the way back to Ivan's time. So this is a man who actually did some amazing things. Of course, the problem is the latter part of Ivan's reign, where he genuinely actually seems to have become increasingly insane. There's a point where he actually withdrew from power into his little state within a state, the Oprichnina, and created the Oprichniki, his kind of combination of personal army, bandits, secret police, cult, call it what you will, that went and sort of ravaged the rest of the country. Even when he returned to Tsarism, the role of Tsar, he found that actually he was devouring his own country. He killed his own son and heir. He involved Russia in a variety of foreign wars, which would see it locked in conflict with, frankly, much more powerful nations of the time. And when he eventually died, he left Russia with three interlocked crises. One was dynastic, because there was no obvious heir, and therefore what would follow would be the so-called Time of Troubles. A period of rolling on and off civil wars that would eventually only end with the rise of the Romanov dynasty that lasted all the way to 1917. A social crisis, and also a national one. As I said, I mentioned the wars that Russia would end up fighting with the Swedes, with the Poles later, and also in the south with the Ottomans. So, a game of two halves. But the interesting thing for me is the actual parallels one might maybe also draw with Putin himself. If one looks at Putin in the 2000s, now we cannot obviously avoid the brutalities and the venalities of the time. I mean, there was the horrific Second Chechen War, rife with human rights abuses, and also which led to the installation of the Kadyrov regime, which is still committing abuses today. We could look at killings of individuals who are critics of the regime, and we could just more generally just look at the rise of a whole new generation of Putin cronies and the massive embezzlement of the country. On the other hand, though, there's no way of getting away from the fact that the 1990s Russia was, if not a failed state, certainly close to failing. And what Putin did preside over was precisely a reconstitution of the Russian Federation, which is not an entirely bad thing. the reassertion of Muscovite control, often over particularly unpleasant snake pit local municipalities, intertwined connections of gangsters and their politician and business friends. A recodification of power. And however unpleasant Russia could be at times, frankly, 2000s Russia was a completely different country from the 1990s. And it's one also in which a whole set of sort of necessary reforms were also carried out. I mean, if one looks at the slow erosion of the practices of raiding, even though that's started to recover, generally corruption was brought under sort of greater degrees of control, and people's lives improved dramatically. But of course, things have changed. Now, I'm not for a minute suggesting that Putin has gone mad, though I do believe that he is increasingly isolated and insulated from reality, and is increasingly, frankly, concerned, if not totally consumed with his own thoughts about his historical legacy. But one of the interesting things is, the historical discussion about Ivan, one of the issues is, how far was the early progress because of Ivan himself? And how far was it also because he was surrounded by often very talented reformers and advisors to whom he actually listened? People like Prince Kurbsky, who later on would basically become a rebel, the Metropolitan Makary, and there are a whole variety of other very, very talented figures who bit by bit would actually get squeezed out of his circle. Gosh, just like Putin and figures such as Kudrin and all kinds of other sort of loyal opposition voices who are actually willing to give alternative perspectives, and who are now no longer in Putin's inner circle. Now, I don't think for a minute that when Putin goes, Russia will face a time of troubles, warlordism, civil war, the rise of some ultra-nationalist dictatorial types. I don't see that. I think actually we're going to see a sort of a shift to a more kind of pragmatic kleptocracy and a slow drift, towards democratization. But nonetheless, I do think these parallels between, shall I say, early Ivan the Terrible, the state builder, and late Ivan the Terrible, who increasingly lost control of the country, lost a grip on reality, and actually burnt up much of the successes that he'd made in his first half. I do think that's rather compelling. Now, I don't for a minute think this is why we're seeing the revival of Ivan in Russian discourse, but I do think it's one of the fascinating ways in which one can look at the historical terms by which a country seeks, or not a country is wrong, by which a regime seeks to define itself and its country, and actually looking at what are the interesting subtext and interesting parallels that one can draw from that. History does not ever actually tell us exactly how the future is going to be. What history does give us, though, is an amazingly powerful toolbox for understanding how people and how societies can develop, and it's then up to us to try and apply those tools to the reality. So that's my quick take on the ironies about Putin's Russia now becoming increasingly infatuated and fascinated by Ivan the Terrible. Thanks very much.